Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone and where you're listening to this from, now or in the future, somewhere across this wonderful little ball of dirt that's flying around the sun. This is another episode of the Prepper Ninja podcast, and today our episode is about redundancy and fire. These are two things that we're going to discuss and how they interact with each other and how each one of them is a separate tool and concept on its own. I hope everyone out there is being safe in the middle of this time of pandemic and lock-ins and restarting. Whatever you're doing in your particular section of the world, I hope that you're being safe and respecting others. I'm not going to judge anybody on whether they believe this is real, a life and death danger, a hoax. Whatever you personally believe is great, but respect your fellow man and don't try to impose those beliefs on someone else. That's always important. So today, in the subject of redundancy, that's a big issue. Prepping is redundancy because we're trying to be redundant with daily life. Because when daily life falls through the cracks or fails, we have to be able to pick it up and mimic it in some way. If one of your vital services in society suddenly becomes unavailable, you have to have a prepared copy of it. You don't get to go to the grocery store for food? Well, hopefully you've got a garden, and you've got a pantry at home that's stocked, and you've preserved food, and you have a safe water source. That's what prepping is about redundancy. On the micro level, on the microcosm of what we do, redundancy has to do with the things that we use and how we prepare. If you have a knife, we're just going to go with the most basic example here, and you go out and you use it in serious stressful situations, if that knife fails, then your overall survival mission fails. So this is where we start talking about redundancy. There's a saying that I hear a lot, and I hear it two different ways depending on who is saying it and how they heard it. It's either one is none and two is one, or two is one and one is none. What they're trying to say with that statement is that if you take one of anything, it will break. That's Murphy's Law. That's the way of the universe. Things actually happen in a very ordered fashion in the universe. You might think it's chaotic, but that ordered fashion is entropy. Things decay, things rust, things break. Especially if you're out there using them very hard. So if you're going to go out with a knife and you're going to have to use it for shaving kindling for fires, you're going to be cutting tent stakes, helping notch logs. Eventually, this is going to be a lot of wear on this particular tool. And so it's always good to have a backup. Two is one is what that means. Because one of those two is going to break, and now you have one again. If you have one, it will break, and one is none. So you got to think about redundancy in everything that you take out into the field with you. No matter what the equipment is, you need another option. And sometimes that redundancy isn't a physical thing. Sometimes that redundancy is knowledge. So if you get stuck out there with two knives, one of them breaks, now you have one. What's going to happen to you if that one breaks? Well, there's a skill set that our ancestors used where you are able to find a crystalline rock of some sort, something with a very tight molecular lattice. Flintstone is one of the most common things. Obsidian works. Even waste glass. In our modern age, you find litter and bottles everywhere by roadsides and that sort of thing. And everybody knows that you can cut yourself on glass. And a flint is very much like glass, and obsidian pretty much is natural glass. If you find the resources of one of those materials and have the skill set to nap the flint, and you can look up any of these terms. I'm not going to go into how to nap flint because this is a podcast and it's a little bit more of a visual thing. But if you chip the edge of glass or flint down to the point that it's a fine edge, it is as sharp or sharper than a razor blade. It will cut you. It's not a consistent, long, flat, even edge, so you have to cut with the small area that you're working with. But if you consistently nap along an edge and create a knife or arrowhead type design that has an edge, that edge will serve you just as well as your knife and sometimes will last as long or longer if you handle it right. Bear in mind these are breakable, and if you handle them wrong, they will break just as quick as they chipped for you. But that's an example of redundancy. You had a physical item, and once you lose that physical item, you fall back on your skill set and ability. We're going to see some examples in the fire section where skill sets are important, but hopefully you never have to use them. Just like you should always have a knife and not have to chip down a flint rock to do your bidding for cutting things out in the wild. If, however, you have to do that, you should have practiced in a non-stress situation to the point that you can easily make a sharp edge. You don't have to make a museum quality arrowhead or axe just like your ancestors would have millennia ago, but you do have to have a functional tool to get you to the other side of your emergency. And so redundancies can come in many forms. You can have a knife, you can have an axe, you can have a saw, you can have a wire saw, you can have a chainsaw, and by that I don't mean the motorized chainsaw type. They make a handheld chainsaw, which is basically the chainsaw chain modified slightly to cut easier by hand with handles on the end of it. I've used them before and they're amazingly fast out in the wild, and they're compact. When you're thinking about redundancy, it's tempting to just take everything plus the kitchen sink as you go out there into the world, but then you're packing yourself down with like unbelievable amounts of weight and you can't travel, and you have to basically create a new home in place for all of your stuff that you're taking. With redundancy in mind, any tool that you take theoretically should have many more uses than just one thing. For a knife, do you have an axe that's sharp enough you can fur up the edges of things for tinder for a fire? Do you have a knife that's big enough you don't need an axe? If you have a knife that's that big, you don't need an axe. Do you need a saw? So, if you're saving space, you're traveling lighter, and you're taking just the bare essentials, the trick is to learn how to use them in such a way that you're actually making the best use out of the multi-use or multi-tool value of the individual things you've got with you. A good knife is almost indispensable because you can do so many things with it. And there are very few examples of things that are truly universal tools. But when you have something that will perform 2 or 3 vital functions, then it's worth taking along with you. But if this tool only does one thing, you have to ask yourself, is there anything else that would do that function? And is there anything else that is expendable if this is the only tool that does this vital job? And in the concept of redundancy, if you get too carried away, you're going to take 3 of everything, and you're going to have specialty tools, and you're going to have an extra backpack, and you need to have a caravan of cars to go along with it. It gets ridiculous. If you're going to move through a traumatic or dramatic situation with some sort of stressful environment, then you need to be as light and mobile as possible and as universally comfortable as possible. So learning how to use all of your tools is very important. Learning to use tools that do many more things than one function is very important. And taking more tools as backups when those tools are critical. And that's a balance that you've got to strike, so that you don't have yourself overpacked and you don't have too many things and you're just taking everything in the kitchen sink. But quite honestly, out in the world, you don't need a kitchen sink. Just think about it that way. Now, the other topic that we were going to talk about today is fire. Fire is an area where redundancy is important also, because when you're out in the world doing something overnight, even in fairly warm environments, it can drop down fairly cold and you need some way to preserve body heat. If you don't have insulating wraps where you can reflect your body heat back sufficiently, hypothermia can kill you, even in relatively temperate conditions. So fire is sometimes a very important tool for life saving. It's also a great way to clear and purify water by boiling. If you're out there and you have an issue with getting water, and there's the redundancy thing again, did you take water with you? Do you have water purification tablets? Do you have some sort of pan or pot that you can boil water in? Now, to boil water, on that part of the redundancy, brings us back to fire. Everyone should have a selection of small, Bic lighters, little cigarette lighters, little camp lighters, all that sort of stuff. And these things fit into pockets, and you can put 2 or 3 around in the pockets. And if you've ever worked with them for any length of time, they're great, they're fast, and then once you start relying on them, they will fail. So bring several. They're lightweight, they're small, they're easy to deal with as far as putting things all over your pack here and there. Another form of creation of fire is very important. Now, matches can be put into an envelope, they can be tucked into the edge of a shoe, they can be wax coated and put under your hat. There's a variety of little holdout places. Matches are so small they'll fit in a lot of ways and places that you might not even think about. A couple of matches in the brim of a ball cap keeps matches there. If you've wax coated them, then the sweat from your head doesn't make them unusable when you need them. Matches in all sorts of places are good also because they're actually smaller than lighters. So here's a couple of methods. Now, if you want to get into some sort of exotic fire creating methods, it's good to learn how to use a fire drill, how to use a friction saw. And you have many options to Google YouTube videos of how to use these. And they're great backups. But if you don't find just the right wood, have just the right skill set, you're going to expend so much energy and frustration trying to get a fire started there unless you've just practiced it over and over and over and over and over. It's far better to save that for an absolute last ditch, but know how to do it. And keep in mind that you should have more fire starting options. One of the great things that we have in the modern world at every survival store, Walmart, you can get them on Amazon, are ferrocerium rods. They're basically a large version of the same thing that's in a small lighter. When you flick that wheel and then you create those sparks, it's a little bitty ferrocerium rod. Those are awesome for creating fire if you have some sort of tinder like cotton with Vaseline on it or some beeswax on linen, what they call fat wood, and we'll talk about that in another area, but it's wood that has a lot of burnable resin in it from a joint on certain types of trees. Tinder can be created from dry leaves, twigs, shavings off of cedar trees, and those can be started very easily with a ferrocerium rod because it creates a lot of sparks that are really hot and will start things fairly quickly. Those are great because they're metallic and you don't have to worry about getting them wet. You just have to make sure that you have something that's dry that will burn. And those are great options. If you're going to do something along those lines, it's good to keep a small pack of little tinder pellets with you. And you can make those with cotton balls that you take Vaseline and knead into some petroleum jelly. Worked into the fibers of that will create a really good little tinder that you can fluff out and use the sparks and put that under something dry and burnable and get a good start on your fire. If, however, you want to get a commercial version, they have little pellets that are similar to that you can buy at your survival store, at Walmart, at sporting goods places, any place that you buy camping supplies, because everybody needs to start a campfire. Another option is to take a look into old historic methods. Fire starting has come a long way, but there's something that some people refer to as the caveman's Bic lighter, and it's a fire cylinder. And these are really cool things. Once you start learning how to use them, you can pop a little glowing tinder out of them in no time at all, just a couple of strikes, and you have something to start your fire. The fire cylinder basically uses the same principle that modern diesel engines do by compressing gas to the point that it, at high compression, raises its temperature. So there's a little piston that goes inside a little cylinder, and they used to make these out of hardwood and use tallow and plant fibers to create a little sealing ring on it. And you put your tinder down on the end of the piston in a little slot and strike it down into the airtight hardwood cylinder hard and fast, and then when it pops out and the air hits it, you have a little glowing ember that you can start your fire with. These are a fascinating tool and something great to learn how to use because they're faster than other primitive methods, but they're very difficult to make in the wild. You are more likely going to have one with you as a novelty to find a backup method that's waterproof and so forth. But it's a good skill set to know because it is possible to make one out in the wild. It is, however, one of the hardest things to do construction-wise for a survival tool, especially in the fire area. It's much easier to use a fire saw than it is any of the other things. A fire drill or a fire bow is probably the second easiest, or next easiest, and then down to the fire cylinder area for the harder ones. And these results, of course, may vary. You may have a dedicated skill set that makes these absolutely easy for you, where other people just can never get a fire with a fire saw or bow. The point is that there's so many ways that you can use fire as a tool in warming yourself, in cooking your food, in boiling your water, purifying things, and heating things. Let's consider fire one of the most useful functional tools that you can take. So redundancy in fire is very important, very much so, very much like redundancy in any other of your tools. When you're looking at redundancy in all of your tools, think about how big the tool is, how much do you have to pack in weight, how many of these types of tools you have to keep with you to make sure that you're safe if one breaks, and can you just learn a skill where you don't need a tool? One of the most important things that I think any of us can do in preparedness is learn skills, because just like sharpening your knife on a regular basis, you should sharpen your mind. You should reach the point where you have skill sets that are redundant and work with any tool that you can find, improvise, pick up, or pack in with you. These skill sets will save your life. They are the most important tool that no one can take away from you. So, everyone out there in podcast land, I'd like to say it's good to have you here with us, and I want you to come back and listen to the next episode. Be safe,